Sonic the Hedgehog, Robotnik's Revenge, 1994. It starts out explaining the backstory of SatAM in a few paragraphs. Why is it called a roboticizer by a lame other name? The Robo Machine. Too bad it starts out with a scene from Eggman's point of view with nothing happening for the longest time, so that's really boring and unnecessary. I'm only calling him Eggman because it's faster. The scene has someone get roboticized, but it's not someone we were already introduced to and so on. And anyone reading this would already know about the concept. The heroes aren't in this scene, so I couldn't care less about it. It is a well-written moment of Eggman that when Snively barges into his room without knocking with important information and paperwork for him, he tells him to leave and knock first before coming back in. It's a bit annoying, but it's supposed to be because he's the bad guy. And understands how petty Eggman actually is. Eggman tells Snively he shouldn't be rude to his pet robot chicken. I guess he only says that to spite him. I can understand why they got rid of Cluck in the later season. It doesn't make any sense that he would care about a pet. He calls Snively his fumbling fool and gets thanked for it. It's pathetic of Snively, and it's supposed to show that Eggman's got that much power and intimidation factor. It seems like Snively becoming rude to him later in the series missed the point. His character was only respectful to him when he was just like this. Snively says he just found out from a network of spies that Eggman's sworn enemy Sonic has joined the Freedom Fighters. How is Sonic already Eggman's sworn enemy? He knew him when he was 5, but he didn't do anything to him. So this is an alternate universe where Sonic was constantly pranking him before now. Eggman makes it clear that he's never had to deal with the Freedom Fighters until very recently. Snively gives him the idea to capture one of the weak ones for bait. Eggman pretends that it was his idea. This is backwards. Eggman should be the one who came up with the idea. The whole appeal of SatAM Eggman is it's showing Eggman respect by showing his intimidating and competent side from the games. Snively was already helpful by bringing him papers and info. Eggman already had a moment of pettiness, so this is just comedy at his expense. The good moments with Eggman and Snively were worth the scene existing. It just should have started the story with Snively going to talk to him. This was a problem with SatAM as well. There shouldn't be any padding in a scene from Eggman's point of view, because a scene like that is already padding. Sonic runs into the forest and sighs in relief because he doesn't have to worry about swap bots in here. Which only makes sense because in SatAM he doesn't fight them, so I have to assume he knows they're invincible, or he'd have no excuse for this. To the uninitiated, this would be a very frustrating line, because the same story that started out recapping the backstory of SatAM and showing a redundant roboticization didn't explain why Sonic would think robots are something for him to be scared of. It's not like they have a fiery force field around them. Maybe that would make it feel right. Like in the pilot of SatAM, he goes into the top of a hollow stump to use a slide to reach Knothole, which is called an underground home, unlike the pilot where it's not underground. So here it's going with the Archie idea before the show came out, which is vastly superior because I don't have to wonder how Eggman hasn't found the village with flying robots. Sonic appreciates the slide and calls it cool, and Sally just tells him to report like a buzzkill douchebag instead of being glad he's happy, though she says please at least, which is more than most characters ever do. And he complains and says she's always so serious. So at least it's sort of trying to give her a consequence to being this way. She insists that they've got to be serious to be Eggman. Sonic wasn't being serious in most of Sonic Forces and still overthrew Eggman. But Sonic Sprite in Sonic 1 and 2 always had him look serious, so it's no wonder I always picture him looking serious the whole time he's fighting a mech of Eggmans, so he can concentrate fully on not getting hit. The only time Sonic looks happy in Sonic 1 and 2 in canon is right after an adventure. And this is right after an adventure, so naturally he's happy. So there's no reason that him being happy when he's not in danger anymore would make it impossible for Eggman to get beaten. when he's only going to get beaten when he is on an adventure. And he wouldn't be Sonic if he was acting serious here. At least she says please again. Blaze might have been the same way in her position. Blaze has a lot of stuff in common with Sally. Sonic says there's no sign of robots within a 15-mile radius of the forest. So what? Not holes underground. There could be robots all over the forest for all it mattered. The whole village is underground, isn't it? No one's gonna leave the village. What's the point of having him on patrol? Just him saying Eggman's name gets his Uncle Chuck and Mutsky scared from bringing back bad memories. Oh, it's nice that Chuck's in this story, but why are they making him easily scared? He's not remotely afraid of planning against Eggman in the show. And all those bad memories would have had him be a robot with tough metal skin, so he wouldn't have been in any danger. The narration unnecessarily reiterates that Chuck invented the rings, which only works in the context of the show where you only ever see one ring at a time. It would take him forever to put all the rings in Green Hill Zone. It would be better if they explained that these are fake rings with the same wavelength and properties. Tails made a fake emerald, and I never saw anyone complain that that should be impossible, because it's said to be fake. It says Sally helped Sonic free Chuck from Eggman's clutches. That never happened in the show. So this really is an alternate universe. It says that Chuck and Mutsky were de-roboticized permanently, with the rings alone. That's sort of overpowered and defeats the whole edge that roboticization has over badniks, where it's much harder to undo when it comes to one individual Robian. To be fair, rings disappear after being used up, and there's only ever a few rings around at a time. The most there ever were at once in SatAM was a few. In SatAM, the Lake of Rings can only produce one ring every 12th hour after the retcon. That's still only a few de-roboticizations a day when there would be thousands in one city alone. So there is still a point to having roboticization to make Eggman threatening in a way that lasts for a whole show. If only SatAM had rings to be able to de-roboticize. Then there could be a lot more rescuing people in it so the heroes' missions would have a real point. In a show that took until the second season to have continuity. And even then, that shouldn't be literally all they're doing. That would be repetitive. Sonic's reassuring to Chuck that Eggman will get beaten. Why is Rotor described as a sea lion instead of a walrus? In the picture before this page, he looks the same. So it's only barely more creative because his race name is different in a way that's just inaccurate. He doesn't look like a real walrus anyways, so it's inaccurate either way, but it's even more inaccurate. Rotor says he's making a portable robot detector so they'll know they're coming ahead of time, which is only useful in a world where the robots can't be one-shotted. I don't know why they don't just call the swamp bots robots when they're the only robots Eggman ever uses, which is realistic but boring. Do they think the term robot sounded impossible to take seriously? It is, but the word SWAT makes it sound sillier. And the word roboticized is a little hard to take seriously too. Maybe that was on purpose because it's a kids show, to downplay the dark tone with a dissonant comedy, which is always misguided. Humor and whimsy are supposed to relieve tension after scary moments, not during them. But Season 2 had even more comedy, so it's probably using silly terms for the same reason. I don't see the point of this scene dragging on past the Chuck thing. Anyone reading this already knows all of the SatAM cast. It stops being valuable after that because I already know that Sonic's friends with all of these guys and what they're like, and that's what the scene's about now. And they're just like they are in SatAM, so I don't care. It should have just immediately cut to Sonic having an adventure. I hate that Sonic not only calls Tails little guy, but turns down Tails going on patrol with him because he's young, when not only is he older than the games in SatAM, being 10, but he had him in his backpack in the pilot episode, and he never got hurt because of it, since he outruns the robots. And having in his backpack was stupid infantilization, because Tails can keep up with Sonic by flying, and by just running in general. It's reasonable to assume that the people who made SatAM never saw a commercial for the Sonic games and just naturally assumed that they were given all of the information about the games already, because it would make no sense for Sega not to tell them something that matters. But they had too much faith in Sega. It is a shame they never even went to the genesis of a kid they knew and played a little bit of the games just to make sure. But that would require them to even consider that they weren't being given all of the information. And gamers keep forgetting that most adults aren't in the habit of playing games, especially not back in the early 90s. It's easy for us to say because we're already gamers. It's not that non-gamers would hate to play a game, they just feel nervous about trying to start doing so because it could be difficult. Which is how I feel about starting a new file, even in games I expect to like. And I don't hate video games. If they didn't like games, that would have been nothing personal against Sonic the series. It'd be bad faith and childish to assume that for no reason. That's no different than assuming I hate Zelda because I don't want to play Skyward Sword because it's a motion control heavy game. It'd be oversensitive to assume that. I wish they played the games, but their job description was just to make a cartoon. And Google didn't exist till 1998. Sega could have told them to play the games, because then they would have made it more accurate. It'd be bad faith to assume they wouldn't have for no reason, because there's nothing wrong with the game story-wise. So it's Sega that deserves all of the blame for stuff like this. I wish they didn't put Tails in the show. It wasn't worth it because it was almost never useful and his portrayal was insulting. All they were given when it came to Tails was just this concept art of him spin dashing, and he does spin dash in the pilot. So they got him right. The only reason it looks like they didn't is that they didn't have him spin dashing into robots all the time, and that's a problem with every character in the show. The only thing good is that he admires Sonic instead of being sarcastic with him, which is a low bar if that's not enough for anyone. But Tails is just a tiny part of SatAM, so that doesn't make the story bad. It's a minor problem, objectively speaking. It still pisses me off every time I see it, so I feel like it's a lot more of a big problem than it is. Sally gets interrupted by some boring, typical greeting between Sonic and Bunny. I don't know why Bunny says it's good to see you, because it's not like this is the first time she's seen Sonic in a very long time. I wonder if Sally would have been received well if she was like Bunny. Bunny doesn't get nearly as much hate, and she's a canon foreigner too. And then I get to see Antoine interrupted in its whiny lampshading of the boring chit-chat, when planning a scouting mission really is better. Sonic tells him to move aside, brushing past them, and says they should start planning, which is just what he said. It's nice to see Antoine be annoyed. But this is basically the same thing Eggman did to Snively when he pretended he had his idea alone. So why draw that parallel? Sure, they're both arrogant. And they both live by their own feelings. That's part of their whole appeal. But you're not supposed to make the main hero petty. When the whole point of showing Eggman's pettiness is that he's the bad guy and you're supposed to hate him. You're supposed to hate Antoine, but you're also supposed to hate Snively. I think the message is it's okay for Sonic to be arrogant because he's a good person. The problem is everyone thinks they're a good person. So the message to them would be, it's okay for me to be arrogant. Sally's polite enough not to call out Sonic on pretending that getting down to business was his idea entirely. She makes her disapproval obvious, but it's worth noting that she's still displaying better morality than some people by not being worse. The next morning? Why the next morning? Bunny, Sally, Antoine, and Rotor leave Knothole to go scouting. The narration's redundant. Of course they had to leave Knothole. They weren't going to do scouting inside the compound to that place. The reason Sonic stayed behind was because he was the one who went out the day before. So that's Sally being nice to Sonic again, in a subtle way. Or at least she's trying to be. Because I think he would be fine either way. He likes adventures. If he wasn't okay with this, he would have insisted on going with them. Why is Sonic staying behind a Knothole though? So in this continuity, he'd rather sit around playing video games or watch TV. I would have said he should be just exploring the world for fun, but Sonic would have seen all the world by now after over a decade of having super speed. So if he did that, he'd be revisiting a place. What's the point of that? It's something that sounds like it makes sense because he can run really fast, but it doesn't really make sense. What could he do there that he couldn't do at home? To be fair, he could be playing baseball with himself by using his super speed. It's more good faith to assume that we're supposed to think he's doing something like that for fun, because that's more in character, using his speed. I wish it explained what he was doing. He's the protagonist of the franchise, and he's from the continuity that the most people are familiar with. Of course we'd want to know what he was doing. It's such a blatant convenience for Eggman that Sonic's not going with the other heroes because apparently they take turns, when in SatAM I'm pretty sure they didn't take turns. And always all went together on every single adventure, because of strength in numbers. And it's a violation of common sense that the heroes would go on an adventure without Sonic, the only person in the team that has any magical powers. The rest of them are all just the rookie from Forces, personifications of the idea that anybody could be a hero, and all of them being that is overkill. My point is, you'd think Sally would insist on having Sonic along as the bodyguard on every single adventure if she was really a good leader, the brilliant strategist. But the writing makes her out of character because the plot matters more to this writer. So it's not that she's dumb in general, I assume, because that usually isn't the case in SatAM. Rotor has to know this is a bad idea since he's a genius, so why doesn't he tell her? Because he knows she's too stubborn? I hate that Antoine ever somehow thinks he could protect Sally or anybody, when not even Sonic is shown to be able to fight the robots with his own power. So what is Antoine supposed to do if robots show up? Bunny's needlessly rude by telling her friends to stop talking. At first I agreed because this talking isn't engaging. In fact, usually the story isn't because it's nearly nothing I haven't seen before. Sally reassures Antoine that the world's gonna go back to not being a depressing place when Eggman's defeated. That's nice. She didn't have to say that. He was naive to think it wasn't always depressing. He was 5 when he took over, so what would he know? Bunny calls for help because of a bunch of buzz bombers trying to fire energy at her and Rotor, who had run for cover behind a boulder. I love that they used animal-shaped robots in this, because that's nostalgic and more interesting to look at than swamp bots. I wish the whole show had these. They can look like they're still using badniks and have robotization in it. But there's no reason that he would actually put animals in badniks if he can outright roboticize them. Well, it could be that there's only a few roboticizers. Why are the heroes staying in one place instead of running home? Sally, stressed out from the situation enough to ask, didn't your detector warn you about this, Rotor? When meta-wise, it's intuitive that the Swampbot detector wouldn't have detected a different type of robot. Somehow he was dumb enough to make it too specific. But you'd think the way that it would have to work, it would work for other robots too, because it would be detecting lines of programming that every robot has in common. Why would it only be programmed to detect literally all of the programming of a robot instead? So her saying this only draws attention to the plot hole. Bunny starts pounding on the Swampbot's head. Finally, someone starts trying to fight these things. Good thing it was explained in the book that the heroes have almost just started, so she doesn't know better yet. Sally runs towards the Swampbot like she'd have any chance of being strong enough to get to let Bunny go, because she's completely driven by her emotion at the situation. And the idea of running away like a smart person didn't cross her mind, because that wouldn't be as nice for someone who wanted Sonic to be serious just because she was coming up with a plan. Yeah, this definitely hurt me out of character, because this is here to make her heroic. I'd rather she look heroic by actually accomplishing something. And Antoine repeatedly calls her Princess instead of Sally, when he and her are friends. And the reason he does that is because he's the simp for her, not Sonic obviously. Sonic talks back to her every chance he gets. Looks like he's not even trying. Rotor's using his tools on the Swampbot detector, saying out loud to comfort himself that if he can reverse the electrical currents that detect Swampbots, he could send an outgoing signal to them and overload their circuits with electricity. But why would simply reversing it also result in an increase of electricity? It's just written for technobabble to make him have a smart moment. For him to not get grabbed in all the time he was talking, the robots must have been pretty far away from him, so he must have gotten himself pretty far away from his friends first. The SWAT bot explodes, so he did also increase the voltage, and just didn't feel like saying it in the stress of the battle. It actually worked, and he gets to get rid of all of them that way. By the standards of SatAM, this is awesome. I thought he was gonna fail and all of them were gonna get kidnapped at once. So now the Sonic heroes have no excuse for not doing this to every robot from now on. And Rotor would have no excuse for not making extra versions of this invention just in case, and giving them to everyone. And it would be such an anticlimactic, easy way of beating the robots too. But at least it had the creativity of them getting beaten in a way I haven't seen a billion times. But its novelty value would wear out after a while. Really quickly actually. Because the visually interestingness of fighting robots the game's way has a lot more lasting power than just he holds it near something and it explodes. It would have always had to have the robot explorer get destroyed to justify a visually interesting fight with them, as opposed to them just exploding with the heroes doing nothing. And how could it get destroyed when the robots wouldn't have gotten the chance to move? Oh right. It is a shame that Tails didn't get to do this instead of Rotor. I already basically said that when I complained about him not being allowed to go along. But I didn't address the stupid he's not an inventor thing. I wasn't thinking about him because he wasn't in the scene. It couldn't be helped though. Sega of America must have never known that he was a gadgeteer. I say that because Tails wasn't one in most of American Sonic for the longest time. So it's a miracle there was one episode of AOCH where Tails invented a flying bike and was called a genius. Since it's an outlier, it must have just been a coincidence that only happened from the sheer amount of ideas in that show. Playing the games that were out at the time would have never given you the idea that he was a gadgeteer or programmer. He was a pilot, but piloting's a different skill than inventing and programming. Obviously seeing him do that wouldn't give anyone the idea he should be able to do the same thing Rotor does here. It's not like people say Sonic should be inventing things because he piloted the plane if you played as Tails. And again, the concept art they were given for the pilot doesn't even remotely hint at him being an inventor. Tails' Adventure was the first time he was an inventor, but that was released several months after this. In its obscure Game Gear game, of course it didn't change the continuities. So there was just no possible way the writer or Sega of America could have known he should have had Tails do this. Sega of Japan knew, but never cared enough to tell him. Interfering with an American property wouldn't make any sense when they had a Sega of America for that. What else would it be for? Sega of Japan could have and should have told Sega of America all the information about the characters just for Tails' sake. The blame rests solely on them. If they really loved the world and characterization of the games and thought it was the superior way, you'd think they would have made the case universally, so their series would be the best it could be and be their way as many times as possible, for the sake of both their egos and quality control. They must have not seen a point to that because they wouldn't have gone to see every story that'd result from that from start to finish, since only people not in Japan would have seen the continuities produced by Deacon, Archie, and so on. The type of TV companies and comic publishers that never produce Japanese versions of things. The only believable reason for why they didn't care enough to make sure their ideas about Sonic is were known by every branch of Sega was that if they couldn't become fans of those other continuities, why not have the other continuities be inaccurate so their stuff would look better? It matched up with their rule forcing the classic Eggman design to be exclusive to Japan, which is what forced SEC and the others to switch them to the OSCH design. Just because the cynical accusation doesn't mean it can't be true, when humans run companies instead of emotionless robots. So of course they're going to make entirely emotional decisions at times. Like, the board of directors of Sega Japan discontinued the Genesis out of jealousy because it was doing really well, while the Genesis in Japan flopped. The other explanation wouldn't make them look good either. That they were too stupid to think of the obvious idea of telling every branch of Sega everything about Sonic. I'm not saying they should have forced them to do it their way, Just tell them what their ideas were. But it'd be impossible to be that stupid. So that'd be the real bad faith answer. More likely they never cared about Sonic story-wise, because it is just a video game platformer series to them. Miyamoto also never cared about story in his own video game series. And it was Sega of America that had to convince Sega of Japan to even make a Sonic franchise in the first place, when Sega Japan just wanted to be a demo for the Genesis. Sally says Bunny's been taken by one of the robots, so the swamp bot carrying her had run far enough away by the time Rotor finished. And Sally plans to go home to tell Sonic instead of have Rotor chase after Bunny. So she must have known that a robot would run faster than Rotor. So it's not like he'd be able to catch up with it to blow it up. What she should be saying is, he doesn't have enough stamina to just keep running after it. So they're gonna have to stop, and by the time they catch their breath, it's gonna be way too far ahead of them. Sally tells Sonic what happened to Bunny and states the obvious that she's afraid Eggman will roboticize Bunny. It took me out of the story because she should know he'd already know this was a concern. It's not necessary. It should have just had the narration say that everyone was afraid of this. The narration says Sonic grew serious, but then he has a lame line that this calls for a supersonic rescue mission, and it clashes. He's taking it seriously, but still sounding arrogant. He wants to run to Robotropolis, and Sally grabs his arm, and instead of telling him to bring the robot exploder with him, and point him in the direction of where Bunny was being taken, and then go there alone, she says they've got to come up with a plan. That's a plan. That's the only plan they should be doing. And all the time she spent running here, at least someone would have thought of that. And for no reason, she states the obvious again. They already know they've got to rescue Bunny. Sadly, the story goes away from them to bore me focusing on Bunny when she's not able to do anything, and the writers should know we'd know they wouldn't have the guts to fully roboticize her. How do the prisoners here look hungry? You don't look any different hungry. They wouldn't have been kept here long enough to get dinner. She's put in a cell, and I get to see her tell Eggman his plan's gonna fail. She's not half robot yet, so she can't bend the bars off. Sonic somehow feels it necessary to state the obvious that they have to go to Robotropolis and save Bunny, and then he adds on that they have to destroy the roboticizer. Antoine asks how they could even get inside Robotropolis because it has swap bots, even though Eggman had complained at the start of the story that the heroes were being a thorn in his side lately. And why would he say that if they weren't going to Robotropolis? Which isn't called Scrap Brain Zone because that name is obviously lame. Granted, so is Robotropolis because Robo's in it, but at least the word brain's not in that name. There was also no scrap there, just metal. Metropolis Zone has nothing wrong with it as a name. It also doesn't tell you anything and it's a rip-off of Superman. But when that's all that's wrong, they should have just gone with that. Not every name has to be as blatant as possible or the naming scheme would get too on the nose, and people like Superman. I never complained in Sonic the Comic that Eggman's capital city wasn't called Robotropolis, and now I really know why. Antoine really is a moron. It should be obvious that Sonic could get the robots blown up with a robot exploder. But nobody says this. Sally's idea is to tell Chuck to design a giant motorized robot that looks like Eggman. It sounds cool, but I'm just distracted by how convoluted it is that she won't have Sonic use the robot exploder. The writer either forgot all about it, or made the hack narrative cheat of not letting it exist anymore, or at least not letting the memories of it exist anymore, because then it'd get in the way of the plot he wants to tell. How do you think even kids wouldn't be insulted by this? Geez, while it would be frustrating, the writer could have had Antoine trip on a rug while holding a drink and ruined the robot exploder. That at least justify it not being used and give Antoine moment in the doing things department. Anyways, why does Sally say motorized like a robot wouldn't be guaranteed to be motorized? And since it should take a long time to make a robot, why is she even suggesting this idea? Everyone must have assumed that Eggman won't roboticize Bonnie unless the heroes are there to witness it. This isn't how Eggman was like in SatAM when Antoine and Sally were captured in his base. This writer ended up understanding Eggman from the games better. The same guy who insisted on fighting Sonic himself in the Eggmobile, which could only be from sadism, is of course going to do something else just out of sadism. Of course he's sadistic.